welcome to all of you here this morning, and welcome to our esteemed panelists. I'm really looking forward to our conversation this morning. So the series of conversations here at Art Basel Hong Kong this year are coordinated with and commemorating the 25th anniversary of ArtAsiaPacific magazine. So for our panel this morning on the early days, the Chinese art market in the 1990s, it makes sense, I think, to really look at that era starting roughly from when ArtAsiaPacific magazine was founded in 1993 through to the end of the 90s, 1999, which, believe it or not, was 20 years ago. But before we sort of get into the meat of talking about the 1990s, I think it will be helpful to have a bit of historical context as to where Chinese art in the 1990s came from and the background to that. And in particular because many, or if not all, of our panelists have very deep and long involvement and experience in the art market in China, going back to the 1980s and even the 1970s. So just to begin, I guess when we think about the contemporary era of China, the natural starting point for that is the beginning or the end of the Cultural Revolution and the beginning of the opening up and reform period initiated by Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. So perhaps to begin with, Claire, if you could tell us a little bit about the beginnings of the contemporary Chinese art market, looking at that sort of 1970s, 1980s era.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anthony. It's a great pleasure to be here. I feel a bit of a ring-in terms of not having sufficient credentials really to be talking about the art market. I guess my interaction with the art market has been kind of indirect, to say the least. And I think that's an important perspective. My role has really been kind of as a student in China beginning in the late 1970s. And then working as a curator in museums, large museums in Sydney in Australia, and assisting institutions to acquire works of art. Over the period of time, I've developed kind of very strong friendships with Chinese artists, and some important artists from the late 80s and early 90s, whose work's been included in exhibitions that I've been involved with, have entered museum collections, and I guess that has contributed to their status and therefore to the whole kind of art market story. So I suppose, now working at the University of Melbourne, I bring a historical kind of dimension to this, contemporary kind of period. Constantly wanting to remind us that there is a long backstory to this contemporary flourishing art market that really gathered momentum in the early 1990s. All of us here have deep and diverse experience of that period, so I guess I can only talk from my perspective. But really, kind of the beginning, as Anthony said, was the late 1970s with the changes that were happening in China, the resumption of the national art exhibitions, the resumption of publishing, a magazine like World Art publishing in 1978, the efflorescence, if you like, of art groups, artists organising themselves, creating exhibitions, the reopening of universities, after the end of the Cultural Revolution, Central Academy of Fine Art, 1978, the ability for foreign students like myself to apply to enter the art academies in that initial intake. The role of artists who were central to the construction of modern Chinese art in the pre-1949 period, who had survived and were there in academies. So the intergenerational mentoring that happened, still in that difficult kind of late 1970s period. And I guess then, of course, another thing that I've been interested in is the overseas exhibitions that came into China that actually allowed, art students and the population more generally to see original works of art and, for the first time in many instances. So I'm thinking here of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston show 1981 that looked at a survey of American art from the 18th century through to the 1980. Japanese woodblock printing, 1982. You know, these are exhibitions that travelled all over China. Picasso exhibition in 1983, and of course Rauschenberg in 1985, and you know, an Australian exhibition, 1989. I think one of the very earliest times an exhibition of contemporary art was shown in China. This was in 1989, so a very significant period, and that exhibition that came out of Queensland, now better known for the APT, Asia Pacific Triennial, but that exhibition travelled to Beijing, Wuhan, Shanghai and Guangzhou. So I guess, I mean, you know, I'm always mindful kind of this earlier kind of history, and of course, you know, the traffic of people going into and out of China, you know, that all led into the 1985 New Wave art movement, China avant-garde, and you know, and the formation of, you know, and the creation of activity both within China and outside of China in the early 1990s. You know, I guess leading up to the formation of, or the founding of ArtAsiaPacific, very important in 1993, which is our starting point. And, you know, just acknowledging kind of the activity, you know, that was happening all around the world at around that time. So I guess, sorry, anyway, it's a long introduction, but just putting on the table kind of some key points from my point of view for us to bear in mind as we're thinking about, you know, the period that emerged after, in the early 1990s, which of course is a reaction to kind of, you know, in many ways, a reaction to what had happened in those earlier decades.
No, thank you, Claire. That's very helpful background indeed. I guess then turning to the very early 1990s, and before we get into sort of the post-93 period, 1992, Karen, was an important year for a number of reasons. From the macro political level, Deng Xiaoping made his famous southern tour to sort of re-kickstart reforms after the 1989 post-Tiananmen freeze. But there are a couple of other key events in 1992 that sort of really were the genesis of the Chinese art market in the 1990s. Would you like to tell us a bit about those? I think it could be on.
It should be on, yeah, hi. My time in China follows a similar kind of pattern to Claire here, that I went up to research Chinese art, but a lot of that impulse came from my being in Hong Kong from 1990 onwards, which was when Johnson actually started the gallery, and the Hong Kong Art Centre, I think it was with your assistance, did the exhibition of Xu Bing and Gu Wenda. You know, these were the first exhibitions of really leading Chinese artists that were coming out. So that was my first experience, and what really prompted something about the new art that was happening that was really exciting. And I was very fortunate that actually Johnson took me to see a lot of the art that you were bringing out in preparation for the 1993 Venice Biennale and the exhibitions that you were organizing. So at that time, I don't think people spoke of an art market. The gallery was just being set up. Galleries were not a thing that existed within China. And where I think art had been sold was for exhibitions that went abroad, like to the Pasadena exhibition, which was in 1987, where due to the fact that China was quite closed and there wasn't really easy modes of transporting art in and out in a way that you could declare what it was, a lot of the work that went abroad to exhibition would be bought from the artists. And I think that, of course, the artists were thrilled about that. I don't think we can talk about that as being sort of an art market per se. But this was really the start of artists feeling that they had an affirmation that their work had a value. And I think that what was really important about the early 1990s was these different steps that happened along the way that gave different degrees of affirmation. And one of those actually again began in Hong Kong, because in 1992 there was the first Asian art fair that happened here. And it was really exciting because, having been in Hong Kong at that time for several years and worked for an art magazine then which was called Art Tension, where we tried to organize a series of exhibitions to show young Hong Kong artists, and regularly we had support from the Bank of America Tower, actually, that gave us their facilities, and regularly organized exhibitions for young Chinese artists, where the only people to turn up were myself, the artist, and the waiters who were stood there with the canapes. You know, it was really interesting to suddenly see the Asian Art Fair, which took place in November 1992 here, and suddenly put a lot of art in one place at one time. And because China, everything that sort of happened post sort of 89, where there'd been sort of a closing down, was where there was sort of a precedent, or somebody had shown the way that meant it was okay for artists to follow. So I think that knowledge, because you just mentioned the Deng Xiaoping speech, which was really aimed at propelling the economic reform faster forward, because I think it was felt that it had stalled at the end of the 1980s, and particularly with sanctions that were imposed after 1989. So there was this real impetus that Deng Xiaoping had given a signal. It was okay to develop the economy. Hong Kong was doing this art fair, and so Guangdong, being a big trade zone in China, and having had the Canton Trade Fair that had been very successfully organized, I think from 1957 onwards, Guangzhou became the natural place to do a China version of the art fair. And of course, because it's indicative of the time that actually artists were less interested in actually selling art than actually having a platform, so they called it the Guangzhou Art Biannual, and sort of art fair was tagged on almost in brackets at the end. And that was what was really important, was to get some sort of critical affirmation. So it happened, I think, within a week or a couple of days of the opening in Hong Kong, that it happened in China. And of course, at that time, people were just interested to see things. And I think that even though it sort of set a signal that perhaps art could have a monetary value, I don't think that we really see the market picking up until much later. But that really wasn't what was interesting to artists. People coming in like Uli to collect the work wasn't really about the money that they could get. It was about him giving affirmation that the work had a critical value. And I think again and again we see that being important. And actually, sort of like the real art market values don't come into play until like 2006, when you get the auction happening in New York, which then takes the whole art world to a different level. So the 90s, money is an important issue because artists need to survive, but actually it was a period of China where you didn't really need very much money to survive. And just being able to do things, to have different platforms, to have different ways to show the art, became really important. And if collectors did come in and perhaps the work got sold, it was just a bonus. So.
Thank you. So I guess turning to 1993 now, and with that background of everything that had been happening through the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s, you mentioned that the Venice Biennale in 1993, Karen, which I think many point to as sort of that point where all of these things that have been happening in China interfaced with the rest of the world for the first time, or sort of stepped out into the outside world, and there was that sort of that first point of interaction between contemporary art in China and the wider world. I'm not sure, do one of you wish to speak to the Venice Biennale and China's involvement in that year in 1993?
1993, yes, but before that, I'd like to follow up on what Karen was saying about the relation between the market and art production in China in the 80s. I absolutely agree, because the market was not a term of a negotiation of artistic production for the experimental artists. And artists saw themselves as part of a cultural movement. So they saw themselves as a movement not just within visual arts, but something that is integral to the whole cultural change, transformation, and making contributions to what they saw China was moving towards at the time. And in a way, the significance really of the year before 93, from 1989, the China Avant-Garde exhibition at the National Gallery in Beijing, which was a defining moment of really the conclusion of the experimental avant-garde movement of the 80s. It happened at the last day of January 1989, and it was really a summary of artistic experimentation in a very grand way at the National Gallery. But the difference between 89 and 93 was really these 2-3 years of incubation period, which is totally different from what happened in the 80s. Because after June 1989, it was no longer convenient, possible, or it was a positive discourage for artists to communicate, to form gatherings and work together. So, and also by that time, this whole enthusiasm of this collective push for change in the cultural scene and social scene had sort of disappeared. But art making did not stop. From 1990, 91, 92, artists basically went back to the studio and worked more independently than they did before. And there were no longer all these art groups coming together to make shows. But this incubation period also marked the transition of China from a socialist state in terms of social structure, political and also economic framework, and also the socialist perception of what art serves into what we see now after the sudden tour of Deng Xiaoping, this accelerated push towards developing China into a market economy, and I think that big transition from a socialist culture into a global capitalist and then later consumer society was the big transformation. And in terms of the market, speaking of market and how it actually affects art production, only really came even not in 93, I think it came even there rather late in the 90s. Again, as you started this talk with this emphasis on the market, there is one thing that we can say about the market, and it's not on the type of artists we're talking about now, not the more avant-garde or self-perceived avant-garde experimental artists, but the more traditional type of ink painting. I think people who are not interested in more traditional style art will be very surprised to hear that in the 80s, artists doing traditional art, people like Li Keran or Wu Guanzhong, they were making much more money than the most sought after Chinese contemporary artists today. I mean, they make more money in terms of the worth of money at the time, and relative to what they could get with what they got paid for from the proceeds in China. And they will be billionaires in relation to what is happening to the art market today. But that happened because of Hong Kong. Hong Kong as a trading post and as a mediating point for culture. So the first, Hong Kong always had a big collecting circle of traditional, for painting in a traditional medium, so ink on paper. And in the 80s, it became the most talked about thing. And because of the market in Hong Kong, collectors from Taiwan, from Singapore suddenly opened up to this, the world of old masters who had to change their style, and or they changed style not because they had to, but because also the change of the time over the past 30 years, and then they start to sell these things in market in Hong Kong. But what it also meant was that the market indicated something different. It's not just the art becoming a commodity, but more it reflects the fact that there is this huge hunger for affirmation of what is China, what is Chinese modern culture. And I think people in Hong Kong and Taiwan and the Chinese community in Singapore, they affirmed what they mean by China by buying the things which they consider Chinese, which is traditional medium. Nobody touched oil paintings because it will bring to mind immediately socialist art. And oil painting, I think, really started its market with, I think, some exhibitions in Hammer Gallery in New York, some a series of exhibitions which were very well done and very professionally done, starting from the late 80s, and they continue for most part of the 1990s. And but in '93, well, I had been working on a kind of a survey exhibition of what was happening in this interim period, starting from 1990. And originally the idea was to launch an exhibition January of '92 for the Hong Kong Arts Festival. And the Hong Kong Arts Centre had already booked a space, so we postponed it to January of 1993. And the project was launched together with Li Shenting, is the expert from China, and Oscar Ho was the expert in Hong Kong. He was the head of the Hong Kong Arts Centre. And so I worked with, mainly in China with Li Shenting, going around to seeing all the studios and all the art academies to pick the artwork. But by that time, it was quite clear that this whole passion for a type of cultural change the artists were aiming for in the 80s had already changed in nature. So we looked at, well, basically I was looking for artworks by artists who were active in the previous years, but who had totally changed their styles after from 1990 on. And the idea was to show what was the new artistic markers of the new decade, the spirit of the 90s. So that was the post-89 exhibition that was launched in Hong Kong for the Hong Kong Arts Festival in January, and it went to Sydney, and Claire was involved in that in the early summer of '93, and then it traveled on and was actually traveled for 5 years. The Venice Biennale in '93 was actually initiated by Oliver Achille. He realized that it was possible to do an art exhibition, so he came to China and initiated this show. But the research started rather late. It started really towards the latter part of '92, and they selected a number of artists. A lot of them were involved in the post-89 exhibition in '93. So that became the first Venice Biennale exhibition of Chinese art in Venice. And then it followed up again with several artists in the centenary exhibition in Venice in 1995.
And who were some of the artists who were there in '93 who were showing? Are there any names that are still familiar today? Do you recall?
Almost all the names that were familiar today, earlier, a few years ago, were in that show. The artists who were in both the '93 and the '95 Venice Biennale were Zhang Xiaogang, Liu Wei, only the two of them in '95. And in '93, there were all the others. But maybe in Venice, I don't know if Zhen Fanzhi was in that show, but he was in the post-89 exhibition.
Okay. So as moving because we canter through the 1990s, one of the next notable events that I wanted to hear a little bit about was the Yuanmingyuan Artists Village, which sort of played a pivotal role in the mid-1990s before it was closed down. Do one of you want to talk a little bit about what that was and who were some of the key artists associated with that and what happened? Perhaps Claire or Karen?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit that needs to be put in context for this village, because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of things that happened with Chinese art often had a precedent, or there was a signal that it was okay to do something. And moving into this area around the Yuanmingyuan was something that was signaled by a government policy, change in land. There was a policy about new countryside, which meant for the first time to accommodate the first drift of migrant workers that were coming from the outside into the cities. The cities were expanding and they needed to grow to accommodate the new workers. So areas on the fringe of Beijing were reassigned as new countryside, which meant that people living there were actually allowed to build buildings. And for the first time, you then had buildings that these sort of farming people could rent out. And this was something very significant because, of course, before that, everybody in China works for a work unit. So there was no independent living accommodation, there was no housing market, there were no independent housing developments. And this is, part of the very significant change that does happen as a result of the opening and reform through the 90s, beginning around 1995, when the government encouraged people to buy their own apartments, which then also meant that some families had 2 apartments and they started to rent out other apartments. So to put a background there as well, that you had to have a permit to be able to live somewhere. So it wasn't just enough that you wanted to move somewhere and it was okay. You had a residency permit and everything on your ID card would tell the public security or anybody who wanted to look at it exactly where you were registered to live. And this was a very challenging thing for some of the artists who came from areas around the outside of Beijing, who'd studied at the academy, who weren't assigned a job upon graduating from the academy, because prior to that, again, the socialist system meant that everybody graduating from university would be assigned a job. But the changing economics of the 1990s meant that it was not possible for the government units to accommodate so many new graduates and people coming outside of schools. So you had a group of educated people who were then independent, which was also a new phenomenon. And of course, among the artists, they wanted to be independent because, of course, they wanted to create and be artists. So the Yuanmingyuan was one of the first countryside places where there were these new little brick houses that were built. And for people like Fang Lijun, who was one of the first to move in, they were just a brick hut, really, with no windows, no glass in the window. He had paper for windows and froze through the winter that he was living there. And because, right through the Cultural Revolution, right through this period of opening and change, you still have a very centralized control where everybody's registered. So in the early 1990s, where you start to have this migration of people, the government starts to become aware that you have groups of people that you're not in control of. And for the places that the artists were living, Yuanmingyuan was not specifically an artist village. It becomes known as an artist village because, of course, that's the dominant part of the population. But like many other areas, it was actually like the East Village, which was the performance artists. It was actually an area that was kind of settled by a lot of migrant workers. In terms of the artist village, there were actually a lot of young, you wouldn't call them business people because they weren't yet business people, but people who were working in some of the new areas of technology that were happening in the north of Beijing, for example, or around the universities areas. There was a whole new technology zone where you had people coming to get jobs. So the government becomes aware that they've got these clusters of people that they don't have any control over, and that's really what led to a lot of the surveillance that was going on. And of course, the artists were particularly unusual in what they were doing because nobody understood what art was. And they were painting very large, very strange paintings of, in Fang Lijun's case, big laughing faces, and nobody could understand why they weren't painted properly. They weren't painted like proper portraits, or they didn't look like the kind of art that you should have been taught if you'd been through the academy system. So this encouraged a lot of surveillance of what people were doing. And of course, this was exacerbated when you had people like myself, people like Johnson, people eventually like Woolley, making regular visits to this place, because why would foreign people want to go and see this weird stuff that was happening in these places? But at the same time, of course, the popularity on the back of exhibitions like the ones that Johnson just described, the artists going to Venice, there was beginning to be an interest. And of course, there was a whole series of exhibitions that began to happen in Germany, in particular, through the mid-1990s. And, you know, gradually these artists were accumulating what was then a small fortune. And again, due to the changing government policy, people like Fang Lijun, once they had a little bit of money, were able to move out a little bit further and build their own houses, which of course was an astonishing thing to be able to do. If you can imagine that you'd gone from sort of a 1980s, you've got a little bit of a cultural spring, people feeling there's a little bit of freedom. You then have a 1989 where everything seems to be closing down. And then by 1994, you have these artists going to build very expansive, self-designed studios that would be the envy of most artists I could think of in London, working out of their back gardens or something in the shed. So, you know, it's a very interesting sort of period in how these things unfolded. But that sort of sense of, as I mentioned earlier, doing something, the artist village really gave a face to a new form of art. I think Johnson just described, you know, what people were trying to do after '89, trying to come up with something that was more independent. In these places, they were able to work, they were able to develop, they were able to communicate with each other. They had a lot of dialogue with visitors who were coming in. And I think that impetus was actually, in spite of all of the kind of surveillance, which of course is it's the sexy story that gets all the headlines, but actually what was really important was the fact that they were together and able to really focus on creating great work. And of course that became such an important part of what was then understood as this new art movement that unfolded through the 1990s. So.
And I think it'd be remiss of us not to mention, while mentioning artists doing strange things in the village, Junghwan smothering himself with honey and sitting in an outdoor toilet for hours upon end, which was certainly a notable performance. So, Uli, you've been sitting very patiently here, and I think we'd really like to hear from you now in terms of just, I guess, now you have the world's most preeminent collection of contemporary Chinese art from this era, and you're very generous gift is going to be the cornerstone of the M+ Museum when it opens here in Hong Kong in the coming years. But casting your mind back, could you tell us all how you became to be involved in this and your experiences in the early years of building up your collection and being involved in the Chinese art world?
For once, it's a privilege to be so incredibly old. So I could follow the contemporary art from day one, from 79. So my first interaction with Chinese contemporary art was then, I was struggling in, at that time, society without a legal framework to establish a first joint venture company. And in that struggle, I also met with Jerome Cohen, who was a professor in law, and he was studying the Chinese emerging legal system at the time. And his wife, Joan Liebel Cohen, which I think we all know here, she, in my view, was the first person, you know, like as of late 70s and 80, did a lot of research. She had her free time, and she traveled around and met as many artists as possible, recorded what they talked about, took photos. So that was my first contact, really, with Chinese contemporary art through her. And yeah, she introduced many artists and much of the art produced at the time to me. But as we have heard, there was nothing like a market for a long time. And I personally didn't buy anything because, to me, looking with a Western eye, I found it actually not interesting. It was, much of it was like derivative of Western art for me, so I was looking and interested in the forefront of contemporary art, couldn't find it. So if we fast forward to the 90s, things, as we heard, started to change. Still, in Europe, it was almost not possible to see Chinese contemporary art. Yes, it was exhibited, and I mean, Johnson was really, I think, the first taking it, even different continents. But it didn't have much of an effect yet in terms of, people being induced to buy. So I couldn't see anything, say, in Europe, except small exhibitions. They would attract maybe sinologists, they would attract some China freaks, but they never found a larger audience. And so while in China, living in China, that time as ambassador, I, of course, started to investigate where could I find it. And the beginnings of a market, I would say, is around, briefly before, maybe around 94, 93, something like that. The first gallery was it called the Hammond Gallery, was a Chinese in Beijing who, did a lot of trading, but some what we would consider contemporary. And then, like 95, Shang Art in Shanghai emerged, and maybe the first contemporary gallery there. And very soon thereafter, Karen opened her gallery, Courtyard Gallery in Beijing. So these were really the pioneers in China. And then what I found interesting, that's why I supplied some of these images, the very first auction of Chinese contemporary art, Sungari Auction House, 96. And Lang Lin, that time curator, he had to put together an auction. And Sungari was owned, or may still be owned, by Liu Tingting, a woman living in Beijing, and she told him, you have to talk to Uli to sort of screen, what's going to be auctioned. So we went through a whole list of works and made this selection. And it's so interesting to see some of these works here, the image and the estimates at the time. Actually, the auction was not very successful. Karen also there. I remember she bought a painting by Pan de Hai at the time. I bought something, not a successful auction. In order to attract a wider audience, there was also a section of impressionist and modern prints, and I think one of them sold in the end. So that was the very first auction. Another auction followed 1 year later. So, something like a market started to shape up. But, mid-90s, we were still talking about hundreds of dollars for a work. Then maybe it increased to $1,000, a few $1,000s. And as Karen said, the explosion took part later, after 2000. And the reason also was there was no Chinese collector. You could count them on one hand. Not no Chinese, but very, very, very few individuals taking an interest, because there was no understanding yet for contemporary art amongst a wider Chinese audience. The interested audience didn't have the purchasing power even to buy for a few $100s. And they may not have the walls in their Chinese apartment, to put a painting there. So the people in the know couldn't buy, and others wouldn't buy. And of course, there was also no status to be gained by, owning a contemporary work where everyone would say, "What the hell is on your wall?" My child could do this or whatever. So there was just no incentive, and the spiral only started to turn up once there was money in the game. Then the Chinese audience came in, and they were the ones driving the prices. The international audience, for very long, very cautious. So of course, you opened the market, Karen opened the market, but the people, mainly foreigners, in China, unlike other Asian countries, there wouldn't be like an old money society, that had a habit of collecting. So just new people, professionals mainly, foreign professionals mainly, diplomats, maybe people working as engineers. they would buy, but they wouldn't be what we understand as systematic collectors. You know, they would see something, they would like it, they would buy it, and maybe an important work would end up in some living room in Minnesota, you know. And the owner may for long not even have known it's an important work. Of course, with the auction setting in outside China later, then everyone became aware what the values were, and a lot of material all of a sudden appeared where no one knew where it had been. So I think the 1999 biennial was very important for the international audience because it coincided with the opening of the Arsenale, this very large new space. And Harald Seemann put some 19 Chinese contemporary artists there. And these gatekeepers of the big institutions, you know, in the West, they, for the first time, had to walk through it. They had to look at Chinese art. Before, you know, there were opportunities, but they didn't pay much attention. First time, they had to look at it, and it had some effect. Also, not so much yet. And I had many conversations with people there, and they said, "Wow, you know, this looks so Chinese." Other people said, "This doesn't look Chinese enough, Chinese," and so there was a total uncertainty how to deal with this new art. But it was kind of a beginning for some of the large collections, you know, to acquire carefully a work here and a work there. So that's, you know, well, my view, but more inside China market than outside.
And how did you go about building your collection through studio visits and spending time with the artists? Could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, I must say a person very helpful to me was Karen, because my today bad Chinese didn't exist at the time, and she helped me when, you know, meeting with artists, the conversation and my, well, insistent questioning of everything. So I really started buying only in the 90s, and at first, you know, just I was looking at it according to my personal taste until I realized no one was collecting. So then I kind of stepped up my pace because I then, well, imposed that mission upon me to collect like an institution would. So then I started to collect at a rapid pace. So that happened in the 90s. And then I had to collect backwards as well. And I saw like the market still was then focusing more on the newly created art. And the art from the 80s didn't have much of that value at the time in the 90s, which, you know, then changed dramatically. And then we could see, of course, the auctions inside China and in Hong Kong shaping up, and we could see a few bidders, we all know, who were bidding up the prices. Actually, they are missing now, they don't buy anymore, and that kind of left the Chinese market at the moment somewhere in the, not in the cold, but in the lukewarm.
Johnson Uli mentioned the important role of your gallery in promoting these artists. Could you talk a bit about how you got involved in you know, through your gallery here in Hong Kong, promoting these artists in Hong Kong and internationally?
Can I backtrack?
Oh, please do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, I was thinking about this. Your positioning the Yuan artists as a cornerstone of this sort of we always consider as almost like underground artists on the fringe, and I think there's this tendency to romanticize art, which appears not to be a part of the institutional system, and in fact, I think in China the division between the underground and the above ground is not such a sharp divide, as Karen very beautifully described how they were actually a product of of a government policy to deal with migrant workers moving into the urban centers. And there were small art communities all over China, and they were mostly artists who had already graduated from the art academies. So what we're really looking at is, if you think of Chinese contemporary art as a kind of radical, non-conformative art, in fact, they're all academic artists. They all graduated from art academies. If you do not have a art degree, or you're not involved with one of the better art academies, you're totally ignored. You don't get into the art system. So we're actually looking at institutional art as well when we talk about these artists, as though they are the underground or the radicals. In fact, a lot of artists we consider radical were artists who, for a long time, were surviving on a stipend of the art academy, meaning the stipend of the state. In fact, if one defines underground art in this manner, Hong Kong artists of this era were the truly underground artists. There was no support for them, and they actually had no aura of being an artist, because they were just looked at as failures because they couldn't find another job. But in China, there's always been an aura around these artists, because people know they are graduates from universities. And so the relation between the institution and the artists is very strong, which means a lot of these movements were fostered by the different centers that their ideas developed, and there's also another very strong tie between the relation between artists and social cultural movements. A lot of these artists who we look at today, who were successful in the market since 2005, I think it was, the Sotheby's auction in New York. Artists were 2004, actually, end of 2004. A lot of these artists were very active in social cultural movements. They took part in defining the new culture of the 1980s, and they may not be radically interesting in terms of the formalism of the work or the material, but in fact the way they change the parameters of looking at things and the contents that they explored were part of the cornerstone of cultural change. I think that relation between institution, artists who are working in the social sphere are very different from artists today who graduate from art academies, and they are now totally reliant on the art institution. Artists like Zhang Xiaogang or Mao Shihui or Xu Jiang or Wang Xingwei, all these artists, they were involved in larger or minor reactions, reflections of the social change of the time. But then the early 90s is this incubation period, as I sort of called it just now, is in a way was the time when they actually withdrew from this, and that change from '93 onward was that a lot of these artists realized that they're not efficacious in what they really wanted to do. They could not actually change China or the world as they actually perceived in the previous decade. So I think the change of terms of recognition and terms of affirmation was very important. Collectors like Uli, because he was ambassador, and Karen, who was an expert, or Claire, that kind of affirmation became more important after this big social transformation when economic development was made possible for most people. So in the 90s, the affirmation that was important for artists were no longer the critical writing that was reflected in newspapers and art journals in China, nor the audiences who were going to affect policy in China, but international curators and international critics and important art institutions in the world. So I think all these together built up this momentum of these artists becoming more practitioners in the global capitalist art world. And I think if one talks about the market, I think this is really the most significant transformation for Chinese art.
Oh, sorry,
I forgot what you're asking.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, how did you build up your gallery and your gallery's role in representing these artists?
In the 90s, the Posey Line show went on tour for 5 years. So but at that time, even in the 80s, one of my big passion was trying to put Chinese art into international museums or international platforms. So I did small exhibitions on personal effort at that time as an independent curator or as a gallerist with institution outside. Because like some of these artists who were involved in the 1992 art exhibition and art fair in China, because they thought this was a way to put China on a par with the outside world. So in the 90s, I led two lives. One was trying to stay afloat economically in Hong Kong, but then by then I had some artists who were selling very well. People like at that time I thought it was a fortune, but today it's like people like Louis Chang or this Taiwan ink painters, or Zhu Ming, the sculptor, and also I did a lot of work with ink painters in the 80s. So in the 90s I basically survived on a lot of these ink artists. My exhibition for the more the newer Chinese artists who worked in oil were not so successful as a gallery. They were successful to the extent that they had collectors. Prices not very high, and but a lot of the better works were not traded because I was so busy in my other life trying to satisfy the demand for exhibitions for these artists in international shows. Like I did 3 or 4 special shows for the Sao Paulo Biennale, 1994, 96, 98, 2000 even. And so I was mainly working on that, and also I suddenly realized that I could actually tour Zhu Ming, the sculptor, on the international platform. So I did a lot of work trying to put them into different museum shows and then financing it with my other work in the gallery. So that was great fun. And in fact, Elaine Ng helped me a lot in those days. So that was my parallel life in the 1990s. But the big transformation in the market came in 2005.
With the auctions in New York, is that right?
Principally with the auctions. In the end, it is really the secondary market which defined the value of the artist in an open market. The primary market, one does not really know how much an artist's work is worth because you just decide how much it is between you and the artist and the local buyers.
Right.
But if I may add, the very feature specific to the Chinese market was that the secondary market was rather the primary market, because the auction houses would directly walk into the artist studios and choose the work and would sell them directly, bypassing the galleries. And I remember this first auction, which was set up in London, I think, also maybe 2005 or something, I think Sotheby. And many artists talked to me at the time, and they said, that someone visited my studio, Sotheby or some. Who are they? Who are they? And they want my work for auction. Can I give them the work? Will I ever see the money again? Will I ever see the work again if not sold?
Who are these Sotheby's characters?
Yeah. So I had a number of interesting conversations, and maybe you had similar conversations at the time. And so some artists came to the conclusion, maybe I give some some not so good work, because if I don't see it again, it doesn't matter. So that auction was a big failure, in fact. Yeah.
So we'd like to leave some time for questions from the audience, but before we do that, I think you've all painted a fascinating picture this morning of this time of dynamic change and social change and of interaction between China and the rest of the world, and a really a multi-layered and complex picture of what was happening in the Chinese art world in the 1990s. And I guess the concluding thoughts I'd like from each of you is what it all means for, or how it compares to the Chinese art world of today, and what perhaps the legacy of this era might be, or how that era compares to what we see in the China of today. So I don't know, perhaps each of you could offer a thought. Johnson, would you like to start, since you're closest?
It's difficult to generalize. I mean, so many things happening. But still, today, the defining institutions of art are still the art academies, and I think that is the transformation of the art institution, the education institution in China is very, very important. The art institution has ceased to be the kind of elite institution it was before. I've done a lot of work together with the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou, and until after 2000, it rapidly expanded. Now it must be one of the biggest art institutions in the world in terms of student population. It has got about 8,000 students, including its satellite academies. But in the 1990s, we were talking about not 8,000 students, we were talking about 400 students, right? And there were about 100 to 200 staff. So the art institutions were built around the teachers. So it was a truly elitist schools. And in those days, as is today, you would have like tens of thousands of applicants. I remember people they're saying around 2000. They usually have to vet about 40,000 applicants for 400. No, actually not 400, but 200 or 150 freshmen, and so it was nearly impossible. It was more difficult to get into the art academies than the best universities. But then the whole thing changed now. And also the interest in being in the art field changed in the last 2 decades. It is another possibility, another choice for tertiary education. It is no longer the institutional pick of the best minds that come to universities. But then the universities also have changed a lot. The art institution has changed a lot. And I think the interesting thing in China now is not just the artists, but how the art academies have reached out institutionally to restructure themselves and try to make themselves the most cutting edge and most global institutions. And I only know Hangzhou well. The others I know I also have done a lot of work, but now there are strings of first-rate global thinkers passing through the art academies. And they're not just artists, but theoreticians, philosophers. Now, in the last few years, a lot of experts in technology and sciences. I think that is the main transformation in art, not really just the art production itself. It would be very difficult to define what would be the best artists or what things people are doing.
Yeah, I would agree with what Johnson has just said. I think the transformation of these art institutions has just been kind of phenomenal. But at the same time, I think there's still a lot of work to be done outside of China in terms of institutions kind of still catching up with what has been happening. It's still it's not a common thing for us to kind of walk through some of the major museums in the world and kind of be able to kind of see a strong representation of contemporary art from this region, the Asia Pacific. I know certain institutions have kind of made great efforts in this area, but I think there's still kind of a quite a long way to go. And maybe some of that kind of relates to some of the work that's being produced, and other factors as well. I of course live in Australia. I go to China very regularly, so my perspective is different from I'm not on the ground as much as Karen and Johnson. But I do think we are in a challenging period right now for artists and for people working in institutions, and I think that that's something that we kind of didn't necessarily expect. A place that we didn't necessarily expect we'd be at, and so I think for many artists, this there's quite a lot of soul searching kind of going on. In terms of their own practice and their own futures, but as Karen said earlier, the most important thing that artists do is get on and make work. But this larger environment is quite challenging.
I understand your question. Where is it all going in terms of market and institutions? And in my view, there have been dreams, late 90s, early 2000s, China developing its own concepts of museums, of institutions, even of a market, or of distribution of art creation, etc. But in fact, we cannot see any of this emerge. And we see the system emulating more and more what we know in other parts of the world. Whether that's good news or not is another question, but that's my assessment. Going forward, we will see more of that, emulating it like a Western system. But there is a second aspect, and it's a very complicated story, but let me summarize it this way. China does not embrace contemporary art for a number of reasons. So many things, legal system, commercial system, that could be done, are not done because of that reason. So, that may hinder a further or a more aggressive development of contemporary art as it does in other countries. And I don't think this is going away so fast.
So you asked what will be the legacy of the 90s, which is a question that has perplexed me for a very long time, because I went to China to research art because I was so excited by what I saw here as being these multiple voices coming out of a culture that, at least in my education, had been told, that under a communist system everybody thought the same, did the same. And to see so many individual ways of producing art, which seemed apparent in the early 1990s, was to me just really intriguing. And through my time in the 1990s, I think we saw so much incredible art that was made. I mean, everybody says, exhibitions were closed down, there were not many things happening, but actually there was a tremendous amount going on. There was a lot of artists organizing exhibitions together, even if they only happened for a couple of days. In Chinese terms, that was already a long period of time. That wasn't something that was, an issue. It was the fact that it happened that was important. And a lot of what we saw was just this really interesting experiment with materials, with ideas. And some of these things were just temporal because the works were temporal. It was all about testing out the ground and finding ways of expressing yourself. and unfortunately, because of the way that things evolved through the 1990s, what's left as a legacy is the kind of the hardware that could remain, which is like the paintings and things, which I think in a big picture offers a little bit of a distorted view of what was being done, because there was so much more being done than just the paintings. You know, obviously that's why for the performance artists, the photographic element of recording what was happening was so important. And I think that the legacy of the 90s is not known, and I hope that when M+ opens with the, you know, the exhibitions that will be shown from the Sigg collection as well, that we will see a lot more of what that legacy is, because the speed of change in China and the fact that I think Chinese people, particularly in this new China period, have such an issue dealing with history. It's so, you know, there's only one narrative, and, you know, within the art, contemporary art, as Uli just mentioned, it's not really embraced. So there are a few dominant narratives, but I think that for all of us who have been a party to what's developed, we might look at those books and say they're very partisan narratives in many ways. That until we have perhaps this, you mentioned all these young intellectuals, you know, until this young generation actually starts to go back and question and dig up and revisit, deconstruct, you know, take it apart and put it back together, then we will see where the legacy of the 90s is. Because I think that, you know, China's under fire so often for its copying, its imitative work, you know, for all this market hype. And what gets lost is actually the fact that there's really a tremendous amount of innovation. But, you know, in the sense of a true avant-garde, perhaps those works of art take time to be accepted, but by the time that perhaps the general mentality comes around to accepting what was avant-garde, the work itself has already disappeared. So without being able to go back and look at it again, or see it in a book, or read about it in a really kind of, you know, interesting way, contextual way, it's actually very hard. And of course the big lacuna right now is that all the young people who are trying to look, and even, you know, perhaps the outside world who is trying to understand, they have very, very little resources available to them that actually give a context for all the work that was being done. So I just hope that with all of this new kind of freedom to research and to think, that we will see some new interpretations of the 90s coming out, because I do think it was an incredibly important decade and it deserves a lot more attention than it gets.
Thank you. So we do have some time for questions. If you'd like to raise your hand, I believe there may be a microphone, but yeah. Any questions from the audience at all? Don't be shy.
Between money and artistic production, what do you think, how do you think artists, Chinese contemporary artists, are responding to the current state in China, and what do you think, in your assessment, the quality of their artistic output? This is a question for all of you. Thank you.
I'm not only me, but I'm hesitant to talk about quality. We can talk about meaningful art or less meaningful art. I prefer that. I think part of the answer is out there. You know, we can all form an opinion. How are they doing out there? I mean, there's a lot of very recent art in the fair. We, of course, know the fair shows only one segment of art creation, and there is another segment of art creation out there that is not here. But I think there's, particularly in a big country like China, there, just by statistics, plausibility must be talents, and they are there, and it's just about finding them. So there is still a lot of very interesting art creation as there was in the past, but the person of the artist has a very different role and status. Now, of course, it's an industry. In the 90s, it was a kind of formulating opinions rather, and you needed to be a very strong individual because you had to cope with a society that didn't want to take note of what you were saying, etc., etc. That's not the case today. So it's a different personality, it's an industry, and yes, there is, I think, very good art and there's a lot of bad art, but this is a global phenomenon and has been like that, since beginnings of mankind, I assume.
I would say one thing, that when a lot of the galleries began in the late 90s or the early 2000s, they performed a very important role where they actually took quite a lot of shows and responsibility towards artists in an institutional sense. You could look at that from Long March, from Platform, from Shang Art. They all did a lot of exhibitions that were aimed at trying to contextualize what was going on. And that was at a time when the rents were affordable and the salaries of the people they employed were affordable, and they weren't really reliant upon selling works to make their income, or they didn't need to sell that many works to cover their costs. And of course, at that time, they didn't have to cover the outlay to come to art fairs to be part of that system either, which is very important. And we've seen, as that's become a fact of life, that a lot of those galleries that did a lot of work to support artists found themselves increasingly shifting towards what was marketable art, because they could no longer afford to put the very big amounts of money that were required for some of the big visions that artists had for huge installations or big sculptural works or sort of very non-painterly works, So you saw artists, galleries beginning to shift towards things that were marketable, and then as the galleries who were able to then come to events like Art Basel began to have their influence, artists would gravitate towards them and then would gravitate towards the type of art that they were selling in order to get a spot within the gallery. So this is how sort of like the money becomes very involved in the production, because it has this sort of unspoken way of shaping artists' ideas of survival, basically. So you see artists taking less risks because it was costly for them to take risks. There weren't that many opportunities for them to show the work, which is where within our OCAT system, which is sort of what it is, but we do try very much to try and show artists, and I think that who are not necessarily getting covered in other ways. We're looking at artists who are influencing artists, artists who are actually having an impact on the sort of the aesthetic or philosophical ideas behind the trends that are emerging. But for institutions, as Uli mentioned, it's increasingly difficult to find a very sustainable way to uphold these kind of models. We're all subject to bottom lines, which are sort of outside of our direct control and have actually I keep coming back to this very famous line that Li Shenting said in 1996, important is not art. And actually, at the end of the day, everything we deal with, everything we have to deal with in order to focus on art, the art is the cherry on the cake, but everything else is really such a challenge. Anyway, I hope that answers your question a bit more.
There's one there and one there.
So you mentioned that the contemporary art is not really embraced in China. What happens when I think we move further away from the difficult part in Chinese history, and it does become embraced? Do you see a disruption happening in the global contemporary art market? Because historically, China, when they embrace something like electrification in vehicles, they totally disrupt the market. So do you think a disruption would happen?
I'm not fully clear why or where you expect the disruption to happen. Could you say that sentence again? Acoustically, I wasn't.
Well, so Hello? Okay. Well, so historically, once the Chinese, say, government or authorities embrace something like in the last, say, 15 years, they've embraced electrification of vehicles, and that's having an impact on the global market, which was basically controlled by the West, Western Europe. And what happens if the Chinese do embrace contemporary art? Do you think there will be a disruption in the global market, or is it business as usual?
It's an interesting question. What would the Chinese public do? Is I understand your question. What would they acquire? Would it be Chinese art, Chinese contemporary art? Would that Chinese contemporary art, have a different essence or a different content than it has today? Or would they turn rather to the international markets, as many Chinese collectors do right now? This is very difficult to assess, but I'm sure it would have a new interest of the Chinese collectors for their own art creation, which kind of is, maybe falling off to a degree for maybe that reason, that it's not embraced, and that many artists have to create or do create art like with a pulled handbrake, so to speak.
Thank you. My question is, what kind of the role the artist, dealer, curator, and collector play for today? Thank you.
Do you mean in a Chinese context? You mean what role does an artist, a curator, a dealer play, and the collector?
Okay. The relationship between artist, collector, and curator or dealer in today's condition.
Well, let's see. I've done all that, so maybe I should I should say something. From my own experience, I've been a curator. I'm a collector. I'm a gallerist, and I would say that question is interesting in the context that how functions specialize in the art world. And this specialization of functions in the art world in China was really only fully settled into in the really the last decade since the art market emerged after year 2000. And well, whether that has to do with, but of course for me the most interesting is whether it would affect art production. Would it give us more interesting art? That is really the more important case, because a good gallerist, a good curator, good collectors, they actually have visions of their own, and their vision will enact on as their visions becomes the outside world that affect how artists actually think of the efficacy of the artwork. And this is, I think, really the significance of all these roles today, because in China in the 80s, even in the early part of the 1990s, but mainly in the 80s, artists actually make works for society as a whole, because their work would have an immediate response in society. They were actually participating in the national dialogue about culture, the national dialogue about the way things should move forward. Today, it is much less possible for this to happen in that manner. So for art itself as a production, then yes, the curator, the critics, the collectors, collectively, actually, they form the mirror for artists, and also the forces that fold the artist's work. But then, speaking about artists' art production and the quality and the significance, I think instead of talking about what artists have done, perhaps the way to really think of this issue is what does the civilization of China today needs. And this is what art is supposed to be doing. Art is actually making an intuitive, a global vision about situations. And this is why we're all interested in art, because they take us out of our boxed-in specializations or viewpoints in order to take you through a sensitive intuition, bring up issues, or come up with forms and come up with shapes of things that make us think more or give significance. And China today still has a lot of issues, and a lot of these issues is common with the rest of the world. But one issue which China has been particularly acute, but Malays has been particularly acute, really is the issue of history, because the entire 20th century had been an attack on its own history. And in fact, the success of the revolution only meant that historical civilization was practically outlawed. It was seen to be the adversary. And today, how to bring deep history back into the dialogue, because deep history is how we actually think today. This is what gives us intuition, which is what makes the nation, what makes the civilization the artist, is what gives the civilization its intuition. And that intuition today should not only feed onto China's relation with its past, but also how it relates to this modern digitalized technological society. And if it comes with a solution from its relation with its own deep history, that would be a contribution not just for China, but really for everybody else who is not part of it, because it is part of the world we live in today.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, so please do stick around. We have more conversations coming up immediately after this, and enjoy the rest of the fair. But most importantly, I'd like to thank our panel this morning, Johnson, Claire, Uli, and Karen. Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you.